All right, what's up, everybody? So today we're going to be looking at building documentation for your Python library. And if you maintain an open source project, you probably know that documentation is generally a hassle and it takes some time to get it right. So hopefully after watching this video, you'll find out that it's actually relatively easily to do with DocFX. So let's start by just asking, what is DocFX? And I'll help you get the answer because I'm a product manager at Microsoft working on docs.microsoft.com. And we actually use DocFX in our day-to-day activities because that's what powers docs.microsoft.com. It's essentially a static documentation generator that can convert code and markdown files into HTML that then you can host on your static site of choice, whether it's GitHub Pages or Azure Storage or S3, whichever that might be. So to get started, what we need to do to generate the documentation first is to get the actual tool. And as I show you all these instructions, I do this locally on my Mac, but you can just as well reuse this on your CI system, whether you're using GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps or Travis. Any choice is the right choice as long as it works for you. So we're going to click download, and this will take us to GitHub releases, and I'm going to grab the latest zip file of DocFX. I'm just going to download it locally, and now we're going to go to my downloads folder and extract the docfx.zip. And if I open this folder, you'll notice that there's a couple of items here. So one, there's a bunch of different libraries, the DLLs. So if you're a Windows coder, you're writing .NET or C++ or any other language, you know what a DLL is. And there's docfx.exe. So a lot of the code that's written here is written with the intent of running on a Windows machine. That doesn't mean that we can't run it on Mac OS. And I'll show you how. And the magic is related to Mono. Mono is a framework that is essentially an implementation of the .NET platform that works across different systems. So with DocFX in place, so I have the executable here, I can now create a new project. So in our documentation world, we have this concept of a doc set. A doc set essentially is a collection of documents that go together, whether it's a documentation for a product or a service. So what we're going to do here is create a new doc set. So this is going to be the project that we're going to be using for our Python library down the line. So I'm going to go to my downloads folder, and I'm going to create a new directory that's going to say, docs Python, because it's our Python library documentation. So in this directory, what I can do now is provision a new project. And thankfully, DocFX has a lot of this functionality built in. So I'm just gonna navigate to my newly created folder and check that there's nothing there. And then I'm gonna use the relative path and just go one level above and go DocFX, yes, docfx.exe. And remember I said that we can run an exe on a Mac OS or on a Linux machine, so I have to use Mono. So just appending Mono after you install the Mono framework should be good enough. So the DocFX CLI has this option called init. This will initialize a new project. If you leave it as is, the problem is that you'll be asked a bunch of questions like, what's the name of the project, who are the authors, what's the version? I don't want to do that right now. So I'm going to use the Q flag, which is essentially quiet. And what this does is provisions the project in the baseline configuration with some fundamentals already set up for you. And you can modify them as you see fit later on. Can't speak today. So let's see. Let's do this. Now I have the baseline project set up. As you can see, there's a bunch of folders. There's a toc.yaml files, which are the table of contents. And this is a concept that we use to organize content together and show you, or the user that's reading documentation on the left side of the screen. That's a table of contents. There's the docfx.json file that you can see here. This is the project configuration file that contains information in terms of what files need to be built, which folders we take them, which folders we transpose them into. So we'll ignore this for now. We don't really need it. There's some fundamental articles, API documentation, and again, all these are samples. So we're not too worried about modifying them, removing them, doing whatever we want. So to demonstrate to you how this works, let's look at what's created. So there's a new folder called DocFX project. So we're going to go there. And within this folder, I can actually now run docfx exe again. So mono is a prefix, and I will go now 2 levels above because we're in. And ideally, I would add this to my path, but because I just downloaded it, I'm not going to do that. So running docfx.exe in this folder will convert all the markdown and YAML files in HTML. So like I mentioned earlier, once you have the HTML, you can push it wherever you want. This does that. So I'm going to click enter, and we're going to wait for the build to finish. Yes, the build finished successfully, one warning, but we're going to ignore it because we always ignore warnings. And here, now, if I click ls again, or type it in, we'll see a new folder created called site, or underscore site. This is where the HTML is. So if I actually will go to my downloads folder, and let's go to docs.python, extend the project, and go for site, notice that there's index.html, tuc.html, search stop words, and all this stuff that we're not going to focus on right now. But if I just open index.html, and let's say Firefox is allowed to access my downloads folder, here's the documentation page. This is my index, right? That's kind of it. It's there. Now, we probably don't want to just use the index, and helpfully so, DocFX has this capability that allows us to serve a site or run a local server that you can use in terms of, going to localhost as you would with Hugo or Jekyll or any static site generator. So again, with the help of our good friend Mono, and I'm going to use 2 levels up, DocFX and DocFX exe. And now here I have the serve parameter. And the serve, what it does, it will essentially create this localhost instance. And the folder from which we're going to be serving is site. And let's see, now it runs localhost 8080. And on this page here, I can just go to 8080. There we go. That's our documentation from our scaffolding. And if you click on API documentation, there's obviously nothing here because we have not yet created API documentation. Articles, again, nothing here because we haven't created the articles. But now we have the fundamentals done. So what do we actually need to do to document our Python library? Because if you maintain Python code, chances are you're writing doc strings, you might be using the typical Sphinx convention. Now, Sphinx is the tool that generally Python developers use to document their code. Now, the problem with Sphinx is that it is very restrictive in where the RSTs can go, or at least in my personal opinion. So I like DocFX a little more here because it has the flexibility of me combining Markdown and YAML files and even documentation from other languages. So the goal for us is to convert Sphinx into DocFX compatible YAML files. So for us, structured content is usually written in YAML and it's written by a machine. So no human actually looks at it. Again, helpfully, we created a new plugin, which is called Sphinx DocFX YAML, that is used to convert Sphinx output into YAML. And essentially, it acts as kind of the middleman that translates everything from Sphinx into the right format for DocFX. Now, there's some configuration magic here that you need to do in terms of setting everything up if you're using the plugin by itself. There's going to be some conf.py modifications that you need to make in your Sphinx project. You need to actually create a Sphinx project and install it all locally, build it, transform it, and then integrate the plugin, which is the DocFX YAML extension, and then generate the output. So there is some complexity involved. So instead, I put together a tool that wraps this complexity into one command. And this tool is called ADG, or API Documentation Generator. So I'm going to go to github.com, then D, and ADG. There we go. So this tool is still in development, but the Python component works relatively well. So I'm going to show you how to use this, and you can look at the source code. It's all open source, decompose it, deconstruct it, and look at how you can do this yourself. Now, if you are really keen on just doing this yourself and not using ADG, you can look at one of my other repositories, which is called Doctainers, that runs documentation processes inside containers. Oh, there's an emergency outside. So we're going to look at the Docker files. And in this case, you can look at the Python one, and you can look at Docker file. And you'll see all the components that go into making sure that you run the process by yourself. So like I mentioned, you need to create a Sphinx project. You need to kind of import all the right information, add the OS paths. It's not that complex, but it just takes time and effort. So instead, ADG does it for you. So what we need to do here is I will interrupt my live server, and let's see what's the folder. And then let's go back to downloads. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just clone the repository. That's really all you need to get started with ADG, just clone. I don't have a release right now that you can just click and use. So instead, just clone the repo. Let's see where we are, and let's go to ADG, and let's see what's in the folder. So we have the SRC folder. A good practice when you run a Python project here is use it in a virtual environment. So I'm just going to do just that. So Python 3 venv, and let's just call it env. Right, this will create a new virtual environment for me to use and install packages in. Now, this, like I said, is a one-liner that you can use to create the YAML files for DocFX to consume. So again, I'm just gonna activate the environment here first. So I'm gonna do source.env. Let's see, bin activate. So helpfully, I can now see that the environment is activated. So fantastic, now we can work. There is nothing you need to install. There's no requirements. So the tool does everything for you. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna do Python. Well, actually we need to go into the SRC folder. So before I go to that, there we go. So now I can do Python m adg make. So the make command means create documentation, platform, Python, because it's a Python library. And then the library argument actually requires us to specify a library that comes from PyPI. So if you already have a library on PyPI, then you can just type in the name. If you don't and you have it on GitHub, that feature is coming soon. But again, if you have the code and you can deal with the extension by yourself, you can most certainly do that. Sphinx DocFX YAML just plugs in. You'll just need to follow the instructions in this project to make sure, in the README, to make sure you set everything up. So I'll do the library, and I'm going to use Azure Batch as the sample, and I'm going to specify that the format that I need to use for the output is actually YAML, because we looked at potentially making the ADG tool generate HTML with the help of DocFX in one click. But for now, I'm just going to focus on the YAML because I want to show you how this works behind the scenes. So let's press YAML. It creates a new virtual environment. It installs all the packages for your library. So all the dependencies are going to be handled internally. It will, get everything set up and then just destroy that environment afterwards. So you don't need to worry about the cleanup or anything of that nature. It's very convenient. It's very easy. Again, you don't need to use ADG in your CI system, where you probably want to have a little bit more control and be able to diagnose things when they go wrong, because ADG abstracts out that complexity at the cost of you not being actually able to look inside of what, Sphinx did wrong or what DocFX did wrong if we decided to kind of plug in and convert things. So take that with a grain of salt, but it gets the job done today. So we'll see that in the meantime, Sphinx generates a bunch of documentation. It produces the RST files, and then it converts the RST files to YAML with the help of the DocFX extension that plugs into and acts, as I mentioned earlier, the middleman between Sphinx and DocFX. So we're gonna wait for that. Let's see. Looks like I forgot the path. Right, the output. So I'm gonna do out. Let's name it test folder. And if I need to rerun it, this time it's actually gonna be a little quicker because it doesn't need to install the dependencies because it's gonna be already satisfied. So we're gonna wait, and now we have it. So if I go to ls and I go to cd test folder, let's see. Okay, now I have a bunch of YAML files. Right, this is not really helpful to look at in a terminal because it's just YAML files. So what I'm going to do here is I will go to ADG, SRC, and I go to test folder to show you what exactly this is like. And I'm going to open a Visual Studio Code. So let's look inside a YAML file. And let's allow it as well. So you'll notice that there's a bunch of kind of information, the descriptions, the metadata, the IDs. This would be very cumbersome to maintain by hand. So nobody actually wants to write YAML by hand. We did not design our system to use YAML as a handwritten artifact. But we also don't want you to manually take the code and then translate it into Markdown and then host it. So instead, YAML allows you that kind of flexibility to still represent the code, but also be easily templatized, where we can then reuse it in DocFX at very little cost. So now we have the YAML files, and like I mentioned, another file that you need to pay attention here is the toc.yaml. The toc.yaml file is the table of contents. So if I'm actually gonna open this folder directly. So we're gonna scroll down until I see it. There we go. So I'm gonna open it. So TOC YAML is a file that contains the list of entities that are being documented here. So I'm gonna look at, shared key credentials. That's all interesting, and just, it's a good idea to verify this and make sure that this represents your library fully. So if you see something that is not on toc.yaml, the process likely didn't finish properly, so you might want to check it and run it again. But if it's here, that's great. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna take all these YAML files and we're gonna move them to our DocFX project, or copy in this case. I'm gonna go here and let's see, we have API, right? So remember how I said that these are just placeholders, so I can move these to trash. We don't need them. And I can copy paste stuff here. All right. Now here, I can go back to my project folder. So let's go to downloads, DocFX. Actually, it's not DocFX. Let's look, it was docs Python, c docs Python, ls, c DocFX project. Let's see. And like I mentioned, we can just run DocFX to build everything. So I'm gonna do that. So mono, and then I actually didn't need the hint here. So let's actually do, because it's 2 levels out, DocFX exe. This will just build the new content. Now, one thing that you'll notice that's a little different from DocFX from other systems is that we don't have live reload capability. So every time you change your content, you add new content, you will need to rebuild the site or cancel out the server, exit or stop the process, then rerun the build, and then serve the site again. So it might be a little cumbersome for now, but it's something that we're looking into. But in the meantime, rebuilds happen this way. This is very convenient in that you can always see the issues with all your files here. So if you look at the output of the build engine, if you will, I'm going to enlarge the screen a little bit so it's easier to read. You'll always be aware of kind of what's happening if there's any issues with your documentation, if there's anything that you have broken links, and you can extend this validation to whatever you need. We have documentation on the DocFX site that shows you how to set custom rules, and if you need to check if the links are HTTPS instead of HTTP, you can add those constraints as well. So again, looks like it's build finished. There's a bunch of cross-references that we probably didn't account for. So these are warnings that in a normal environment, you would generally, and when I say normal, it's production, you want to check those out and make sure that you're not having 404 links or references to links that do not build properly. But assuming that this is just a demonstration, this should be good enough. So here, I can now serve the site because we've generated the HTML. So actually, I can just go back to my command and then serve and site. And now I have localhost 8080. So I'm just gonna go here and replace this. And we'll go to API documentation, articles. Let's see, what API? Probably, we did not configure the TOC properly. There we go. So I'll go to API. So I have package ADG. This is batch service client. I have all the information here. If I go to batch service client configuration, I have all the information here. So it's pulled directly from the YAML files that we need to kind of check here. So I can go back to the API documentation. And I think what we need to do here is to make sure that, let's see, talk YAML, we have index.yaml, that we can also build the TOC files properly. So sometimes when you have issues with a project, go to docfx.json, and I can actually validate here, and actually we'll open VS Code. There's no need to open it with the browser. So I'm just gonna open it in Visual Studio Code, and we can look at the structure of the docfx.json file. So we have, let's see, in case you're building from CS Proj files, we have the capability built in, but we're not. So we're not gonna be looking at that. We're looking at files and API index YAML and the index.md. So we have that. Let's see, we have other set of files, toc.yaml, articles and toc.yaml, okay? And let's see, overwrite, and we probably can just add another folder here in terms of what content do we build. I'll add another toc.yaml here because this is our table of contents. So the content section in your build configuration tells you what needs to be built and which patterns need to be followed. So for example, if you want to build all YAML files, you want to build all the markdown files, and you want to exclude certain files, you can do so in this section. So for example, if you want to exclude a file that is readme.md, it's something that is only living in your repo, it never needs to be exposed to documentation, the docfx.json file needs to be accountable for that, and you can set up that setting here. So I'm gonna interrupt the server again, and I'm gonna once again rebuild the site, and this will look at my changes and make sure that everything that I specified, including the new table of contents here, is accounted for. And actually, if I go back and I look at the DocFX project, and let's see what I have here. There is the index MD, which we see rendered typically. And again, I will expand this. And there is toc.yaml that we can open to see kind of the basic infrastructure that we have in place. And actually, I can do index.yaml here because this is we don't have an index.md, there's an index.yaml, and we'll wait. Actually, I will interrupt the build and I can just rebuild it again because we just changed the setting and changed the file. And builds typically can take a minute to 5 minutes to 10 minutes, depending on how much content you have. If you have a very large library with a lot of content, expect it to run a little longer than if you have 2 classes and 10 methods. So that kind of comes as a natural extension to what we're doing, but there's a lot of expectations kind of, my build took way longer than the build before. Well, did you add a lot of content? And if the answer is yes, then the build will take longer. If you have a lot of validations, the build can take longer as well. So keep that in mind. So now that we wait for the build to complete, what we're going to be looking at is making sure that the HTML files are also ready to be pushed somewhere once they're generated. And like I mentioned earlier, the site folder is the only folder that you need to look at to get that content. So let's look again at what we have here. We're going to serve the site, and we're going to go to localhost 8080, and we're going to refresh this. There we go. So now we see that the table of contents here contains my library. So just with the modification that I did in the JSON file, so I'm going to just go back here, docfx.project, docfx.json, I just told the system to essentially, hey, look at toc.yaml as another file that needs to be rendered. That's the table of contents. And now we actually will have it. So if I go to batch, now I can see all the, the hierarchy that got preserved from the documentation that was generated. I can go to the client. I can go to the configuration, and in this case it's empty. And again, this might be a clue for us to investigate and see, hey, what's wrong with this? Why is it empty? But all this is there. So if I look at the class and I see the method and the description information is empty here, so cue to investigate why it is. But the documentation for your Python library is generated. It can coexist with markdown files that you add in articles. It has the hierarchy in breadcrumbs. It has the hierarchy in the table of contents, and it has the hierarchy in the URL, making it very easy to share. So now with this information, you have the site folder that contains all the artifacts that you need, the CSS, the JavaScript. All this information can be pushed to your storage of choice from which you host a static site. It can be done through a CI. It can be done manually if you do this infrequently. But that's it. That's all you need to generate documentation. And you can make sure that, whenever you change your code, you regenerate new YAML files and they're automatically copied. So I tend to look at these processes as very automatable. That makes it more convenient, and that makes it easier to not have to worry about every little change. But that's pretty much it. So I hope that you can generate documentation for your Python library. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in comments or on Twitter. Thanks, folks.